This is Talk Business and Politics with Roby Brock.
And welcome to the program. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Roby Brock. In the last 2 weeks, all of this has happened. President Donald Trump fires FBI Director James Comey, who was leading an investigation into Trump's ties to Russia. Then the president meets with several high-ranking Russian diplomats in an Oval Office meeting, excluding the American press. Days later, we learned that Director Comey was possibly asked by Trump to end his investigation of former National Security Advisor Mike Flynn over conflicts of interest. Trump may have also shared classified information with the Russians, jeopardizing an anti-ISIS effort. Then, unexpectedly, the Department of Justice No. 2, Rod Rosenstein, names former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special counsel to pick up the Comey investigation of Trump and Russia. And at the end of a breathless week of politics, we're left to sort it all out. Joining me now is Josh Dawsey, White House reporter for Politico. Good to have him with us. Josh, thank you for being here. Let's begin with our first question and talk about the White House. They are embattled. There is an undermining of the message by the president, it seems like, on a every other day basis. Discussions of staff shakeups. From your position of reporting on the White House, what do you see as happening that's going to change the trajectory of the White House at this point in time?
I'm not sure if a staff shakeup will do it. A lot of the folks who work in the White House will note privately that many of their biggest problems come from the president himself, who, steps on his own message or defends things that don't need to be defended, or makes spurious claims that causes days of headlines. So I don't know that a staff shakeup does it. I guess there's an argument to be made that a new chief of staff could come in and impose more discipline than Reince Priebus, the current chief of staff. Mr. Priebus is not very well regarded within the White House, and several people go to the president and say, his days may be very numbered. That said, Donald Trump's 70 years old. I don't think he's changing anytime soon, and I don't know that a new press secretary or a new chief of staff or a new strategist or a new counselor is going to change someone who's lived life his way for 70 years and was given the biggest validation of his life in November with the election.
Well, let's talk about how the special counsel appointment may change at least Washington, D.C. for a little while. It seems to me that it is going to let some pressure off of the Washington, D.C. Culture up there in terms of Congress, in terms of the White House, because I think Robert Mueller is going to spend some time, doing his homework and kind of getting up to speed, and that may take some of this daily reporting off of center stage right here. Do you think that that's going to happen, or do you think we will still see more roller coaster rides, in part due to how the president conducts business?
I think it's both. I think it's a double-edged sword for the White House. Bob Mueller is respected by Democrats and Republicans alike. If he probes this, alleged collusion and, Michael Flynn and all of the other issues in President Trump's White House and doesn't find anything that nefarious, and, I think they can use this as a vindication. That said, having a special counsel as President Clinton from Arkansas would remind you, kind of takes things out of your own hands and puts them in someone's hands who, owes the president nothing, is not a campaign loyalist, is not someone who has any particular allegiance to President Trump. And I don't think from everything we know about Bob Mueller is he going to do the president or any of his people any favors. So I think in a way it does kind of alleviate some of the daily pressure. Washington has been very stressful in the past weeks for President Trump's staff, for Republicans on the Hill, and for others. But that said, I think we're entering a new unknown chapter here where, President Trump, who prides himself on having control of his White House and of his people, I think is not going to have that much control of what Bob Mueller does.
A new chapter, that is always good for political reporters, particularly White House political reporters. Let's talk about Congress. Democrats whispering impeachment at least. Republicans not really offering much. They're not wanting to go on the record, at least from my end of things, too often. But they are talking off the record about the fact that they're pondering a President Pence. Do you think that the special counsel just extends that conversation of farther away, or do you think there's still going to be some of those rumblings? What do your sources tell you?
I think there are quiet rumblings, but I think any talk of impeachment right now is very premature. we don't know anything for the grounds of impeachment yet. And I think some of that is fantastical thinking by Democrats who, hate President Trump. I will say Republicans on Capitol Hill are getting increasingly tired of defending the president and his nonstop drip of drama. I think the Republicans on Capitol Hill, don't know if the president and his team are telling the truth. They are frustrated that a lot of this has distracted from their agenda, trying to get a health care law passed, trying to cut taxes, possibly doing an infrastructure plan. Some Republicans aren't as big a fan of infrastructure as others, but, possibly doing an infrastructure plan. And I think with the Republicans controlling the White House and the Senate and the House, folks on Capitol Hill were really enthusiastic for this year and their agenda, but instead a lot of it has been subsumed by President Trump's, nonstop utter chaos. So I don't think you hear Republicans really saying the word impeachment yet, but I do think you hear rising frustrations and people saying, this cannot continue. The center cannot hold, so to speak.
This is one of my favorite analogies to throw out there. If this was an NBA basketball game, with all of the emotion that a basketball game can bring, we're only at the 4-minute mark of the first quarter, so in terms of this Trump presidency, so there is a long ways to go.
Yes, that makes me exhausted.
So there's the White House, there's Congress, and then there's the American public. Speaking of the drama and exhaustion, do you have any sense from your vantage point of how this is playing outside of Washington, D.C., and how the American public's responding to all of the chaos that you've mentioned?
Well, I think to President Trump's most rock-rip supporters, the folks who would go with him into battle fire anywhere, they see this as attacks from Democrats, attacks from the media. They don't necessarily believe it. They're not changing their mind on him. You see his poll ratings are still around 40%, no matter what scandal has, inflamed Washington that day. And, there are stories out there, reporters from the Associated Press. I've done some of these stories. New York Times has done some of these stories, going to places outside of Washington. And the vantage point looks different. Vance said, you have a president in his first year whose approval ratings are well below 50%. There's been no honeymoon period. And you have a lot of independents who voted for him who maybe said, not a big fan of him, but also not a big fan of Hillary Clinton, who I think are saying, what have I done? So I think outside of Washington, it looks different depending on who you ask. The president's biggest supporters, I think, are still with him. I think some folks who lean Republican, I think a lot of this is overblown. But I do think, you have a historic level of unpopularity for a first-year president, and it's going to take some work to bring that back. I think it'll take a lot of work to bring that back, and I don't know if he can or not.
All right, he's Josh Dawsey with White House reporter for Politico. You can catch his work online at Politico.com. Get some rest. It sounds like you're going to need some rest to keep up with the Trump
Thanks so much.
White House here. Thanks for being with us.
I appreciate it. Okay, bye-bye.